Before you see the street, you smell it. Horse manure baking in July heat, something rotting. You can't tell if it's the pile at the end of the block or the thing that's been lying in the gutter since Tuesday. Raw sewage moving slow through an open drain. Coal smoke sitting low, coating the back of your throat. Then you look up. Marble bank facades, gilded hotel lobbies, electric streetlights, grand boulevards lined with the most ambitious architecture America had ever built, the most beautiful cities the country had ever produced, and they smelled like a slaughterhouse left open in the sun. That was the American city before 1920, and here's what nobody tells you. The decade you think of as the most glamorous in American history, the jazz clubs, the flappers, the parties, the Gatsby mansions, none of that was possible until someone solved one of the most catastrophic public health disasters in recorded history. By the end of this video, you'll understand that the Roaring Twenties wasn't a spontaneous explosion of American energy, it was an exhale, and what people were exhaling from was far worse than anything you've been taught. The Gilded Age looked extraordinary. The 1880s through the 1910s produced Beaux-Arts facades, cast-iron storefronts, department stores that looked like European cathedrals. Cities were spending fortunes on the visual surface of civilization, and underneath all of it, powering every single piece of it, was the horse. Every carriage, every delivery wagon, every streetcar, every load of building material that went into those marble facades. All of it moved on horsepower, and horses have a problem. A single horse produces 20 to 30 pounds of manure per day. New York City had roughly 100,000 horses in 1900. Do the math. That's somewhere between 2 and 3 million pounds of manure landing on city streets every single day. In winter, it turned to brown slush. In summer, it dried into a fine dust that hung in the air, settled on food stalls, coated window displays, and went directly into people's lungs. But that's only half of it. Those same 100,000 horses were producing tens of thousands of gallons of urine daily, soaking into unpaved streets and creating a permanent ammonia reek that didn't go away. No wind cut through it, no rain fully washed it. It was just there, always, underneath everything else. And then the horses died. A horse weighs around 1,200 pounds. When one collapsed on a public street, from exhaustion, disease, or just old age, it didn't disappear. Removal was expensive. It required equipment, labor, and someone willing to pay for it. So horses often stayed where they fell, sometimes for days, bloating in summer heat on the same boulevards where people shopped, worked, and ate lunch. New York City removed an average of 15,000 dead horses from its streets every year through the 1880s. That's 41 dead horses per day. And that number wasn't a crisis. That was considered normal operations. Then, in 1872, it got worse. A horse flu called the Great Epizootic swept across North America in a matter of weeks. Cities couldn't move goods, couldn't collect garbage, couldn't fight fires. The carcasses piled up faster than cities could haul them out. In some cities, people were pulling freight wagons themselves because there were no horses left to do it. Here's what that means visually. The elegant, Gilded Age street you picture, the one with the marble bank and the electric streetlights, had horse carcasses rotting on it. It had manure dust suspended in the air above it. It had urine soaked 3 inches deep into the unpaved section at the end of the block. The people who could afford marble facades were the same people who could afford to not think about what was happening at street level. But here's the thing, the streets were only one layer, and compared to what was happening underground, the horse carcasses were almost the good part. Picture a tenement block on a hot August night, 100 people living in a building with no running water, no flush toilets, no way to move waste out of the building except one pit dug into the ground underneath it. That pit had a name. It was called a privy vault, and it was how most American cities handled human waste before 1900. A privy vault was dug under or beside a building, sometimes lined with brick, sometimes just dirt. Every family in the building used it. In dense tenement blocks, that meant one vault shared by 20 to 30 families, hundreds of people, with no ventilation and no real plan for what happened when it filled up. What happened when it filled up was that it overflowed. Cities employed men called night soil men to deal with this. Their job was to show up after dark, dig into the vault with buckets and shovels, haul the waste out in barrels, and cart it away before morning. It was brutal, dangerous work, and there was never enough of it happening. Demand wildly outpaced capacity. Vaults that were supposed to be emptied monthly sat full for seasons. In hot weather, the liquid at the top of a full vault didn't just sit there, it seeped outward through the soil, under the building's foundation toward the nearest water source, and the nearest water source was usually the well the same families were drinking from. This wasn't a theory. This was how cholera and typhoid moved through cities. The disease maps from the 1880s and 1890s line up almost perfectly with the blocks that had the worst vault overflow. You drank your neighbor's waste. That was the system. The garbage problem ran right alongside it. In the 1880s, most American cities had no organized collection. Residents threw waste into alleys or into the street, where it mixed with the horse manure already there and rotted in place. In summer, the alley behind a tenement block wasn't just unpleasant, it was a solid mass of decomposing food, animal waste, coal ash, and human filth packed together, baking in the heat. The smell didn't drift. It settled, it got into walls and clothing and stayed. And then there was the industrial layer. Slaughterhouses, tanneries, and rendering plants didn't operate on the outskirts of cities. They operated inside them, on city blocks, 2 streets over from where people lived and ate and sent their kids to school. Rendering plants were where dead animals went, horses, livestock, pets, to be boiled down into fat and bone meal. The boiling process produced a sweetish, heavy rot that coated the back of your throat and didn't leave. And it didn't stay at the plant. It spread for blocks. If you lived near a rendering plant, that smell was in your apartment. It was what you woke up to. It was what your food tasted like. Chicago made all of this extreme. By 1900, the Union stockyards processed 14 million animals per year. The blood from those animals ran directly into the Chicago River. The river ran through the center of the city. By the late 1800s, the water had become so contaminated it was killing people downstream. And the solution, the actual engineering solution the city implemented in 1900, wasn't a pipe fix. It wasn't a filtration system. They literally made the river run backwards to push the contamination away from the city's drinking water intake. Working-class neighborhoods carried all of this at once. No running water, shared outdoor privies for dozens of families, garbage rotting in the alley, a rendering plant 2 blocks north, horse carcasses on the main street. Typhoid death rates in tenement districts ran 2 to 3 times higher than in wealthier neighborhoods, not because of bad luck, because of where the pipes went and where they didn't. Now here's the part that should make you angry, because after everything you just heard, the dead horses, the overflowing vaults, the rivers running with blood, you'd expect the fix to come from some massive government reckoning. A revolution, a moment where the people in power looked at the typhoid maps and said enough. That's not what happened. What happened was one man with a completely absurd idea, and the city fought him on it every step of the way. His name was George Waring, and in 1895 he was handed an impossible job. New York City's street cleaning department was a disaster. It was corrupt, underfunded, and treated as a patronage dumping ground. Positions handed out as political favors, not filled by people who actually showed up to work. Streets that were supposed to be cleaned weren't. The department existed mainly as a way to funnel city money to connected insiders. Everyone knew it. Nobody had fixed it. Waring had no political machine behind him. He had no leverage. What he had was one idea that, on paper, sounded almost embarrassingly simple. He dressed his sanitation workers in white uniforms. That's it. White uniforms. Completely clean, completely visible, so that anyone walking down a New York street could immediately see a sanitation worker, identify them, watch them work. So that the labor was public. So that politicians couldn't quietly defund a service that voters could now see with their own eyes. So that the workers themselves, men who had been treated as invisible, as the people the city pretended didn't exist, suddenly had a public identity tied to something the whole city needed. It worked. The model spread to other cities. Sanitation became a political issue instead of an invisible line item. And once it became political, the money followed. Then science caught up. Once germ theory was confirmed, once cities accepted that disease traveled through contaminated water and waste, not through bad air, there was finally a mandate to build real infrastructure, water filtration plants, unified sewer systems, organized garbage collection, not luxury projects, survival infrastructure. And once the scientific case was made, the funding followed faster than anyone expected. Typhoid death rates in major American cities dropped by over 90% between 1900 and 1940, not because of new medicine, because of pipes, because of pavement, because someone finally built what should have existed 50 years earlier. And then, almost by accident, the other half of the problem solved itself. By 1910, automobiles were replacing horses faster than anyone predicted, not because cities planned it, but because wealthy people wanted cars. That was it. Consumer preference. While Waring's successors were fighting budget battles and corrupt officials to keep sanitation funded, the single biggest source of street filth in American history was quietly disappearing because rich people thought cars were more fashionable than carriages. The reformers spent decades trying to fix the horse problem. The market killed it in a decade without trying. By the time the 1920s arrived, the decade of jazz clubs and speakeasies and women in short dresses dancing on clean floors, the crisis that made the previous decades so deadly had mostly been solved. The streets were cleaner, the water was safer, the horse carcasses were gone. That's what the Roaring Twenties actually were. Not a spontaneous explosion of culture and energy. An exhale. A city finally able to breathe. The people who made that possible weren't in the photographs, they weren't at the parties. Think about what their lives actually were. A night soil man showing up at midnight with a bucket and a shovel, climbing down into a vault that hadn't been emptied in 3 months, in July, in New York City, for wages that wouldn't cover a week's rent in the neighborhood he was cleaning. An immigrant laborer laying sewer pipe 6 feet underground, while the Beaux-Arts building going up 2 blocks north would be photographed and celebrated and remembered. The municipal workers who hauled 41 dead horses a day off New York's boulevards, every single day, for decades, so that the people who walked those boulevards could keep pretending the city was clean. They didn't get the exhale, they were the reason everyone else could take it. The glamour was real, but it was built on something, literally, and it didn't happen naturally. It happened because people built it, fought for it, and in a lot of cases died before it arrived.